Thank you, Cara. It is so good to see all of you this morning. Just one additional note, if you are a speaker or a panelist later in the day, before your session starts, this reserved table is here for you, so you can be closer to come up quickly, or these chairs over here with, like May is doing. So good morning, Energy Action Network. Again, my name is Jared Duvall, and May and I have a presentation for you this morning. One of our most important responsibilities to the network and to the state of Vermont is to collaboratively work with state and federal agencies to conduct independent tracking and analysis on emissions, energy, equity, and the economy. We do this to help make sure that climate and energy conversations in Vermont are evidence-based and are grounded in the latest and highest quality data and analysis available. So we are going to share today some of the key takeaways, the highlights from our latest annual progress report, which was released earlier this summer. I know many of you got that in the mail. It's also online at eanvt.org. And if any of you have upcoming events or would like to have extra copies to give to folks, we have hundreds of copies at the registration table, so feel free to take extras with you on your way out. So these are the key findings of our latest report. We know that with the passage of the Global Warming Solutions Act, our greenhouse gas emissions reduction commitments are now law, and that this presents both a responsibility and an opportunity for Vermont. The data is clear that benefits and costs of our current energy system are not being shared equitably. We know through a lot of modeling and analysis that our climate commitments are achievable with already proven and available technologies and best practices, and that when we adopt them, Vermont consumers and workers can benefit from doing so and reducing our dependence on fossil fuels and fossil fueled equipment. To get there, though, it's also clear that we need to build on some of the lessons we've learned in other sectors and in other policy efforts to send clear signals using not just carrots, but also sticks, clear market signals about what needs to happen, not just with the electricity sector, but also with the thermal and transportation sectors, if we're going to reduce emissions, reduce energy costs, and fossil fuel dependence. So let's start with emissions. Cara, if you can do next slide, the clicker's not working. Thanks. So this graph shows both our historical emissions from 1990 to 2018, ending here, and then in the kind of more muted colors, you can see the trajectory that we have to be on to meet our legally binding emissions reduction requirements shown here in the green dots for 2025, 2030, and 2050. I know oftentimes this just kind of gets like heady and what is a million metric ton? Let's just put this in context briefly. For context, that level of emissions in 2018, as reported by the Agency of Natural Resources, very glad to have Colin Smythe from ANR, who's the lead author of Vermont's inventory, here with us today, as well as many others of the ANR team. That amount of emissions was the equivalent of burning nearly 1 billion gallons of gasoline, nearly 1 billion gallons of gasoline. You see here throughout that the emissions from each sector are shown in different colors, with our two highest polluting sectors at the bottom, transportation in green and the thermal sector emissions in orange. Maybe I'm kind of imagining things, but I look at this and I see an elephant in the trunk here, and I really do think that those sectors' emissions are the elephant in the room that we face. Next slide, please. As you can see here, Vermont's emissions profile is quite different from the national average. While the electricity sector nationally still includes large amounts of consumption of coal and natural gas, Vermont's electricity portfolio is now 66% renewable and 93% carbon-free. causing our electricity sector emissions to be much lower than the national average. But at the same time, the share of emissions that come from transportation and the thermal sector are much higher than the national average. Next slide. So this is another, oh, sorry, the clicker's working now, so I think I've got it. This is another way to see the same data just for the year 2018 in terms of how our emissions break down by sector. And our transportation and thermal sectors are not just responsible for the vast majority, about 3/4 combined, of our greenhouse gas emissions. They are also responsible for the largest shares of energy cost burden that Vermonters face, shown to the right in these orange circles. So as a share of all energy expenditures, this is what is going to getting around and heating homes and buildings. Breaking it down even more, we see that the strong majority, 71% of our transportation sector emissions come from light duty gasoline vehicles. This is really the 500,000 plus passenger vehicles that Vermonters own and drive every day. Next slide, please. And on the thermal side, over half of our emissions come from residential homes and about 1/3 from businesses. Most of the residential climate pollution comes from our use of propane and fuel oil heating systems. In the commercial sector, natural gas is responsible for nearly as much climate pollution as those other fuels. You can see more in natural gas in the commercial sector than in the residential. Okay, on to point number 2, benefits and costs are not being equitably shared. What this graph shows is that while upper income folks consume much more fuel for transportation than lower income folks, and that folks in rural areas consume more transportation fuel than folks in rural areas, while that is true, the transportation costs that lower income folks do face take up a much larger share of their household income, especially if they live in rural areas. Next slide, please. Not surprisingly, we see that wealthier folks drive many more miles than others, with folks who earn more than $100,000 a year driving 15,000 miles or more on average, and those making less than 25,000 driving about 10,000 miles a year. Within the Northeast, there are more miles driven per person in Vermont than in any other state, shown here in the green line. This is in large part due to our rural settlement pattern. Those miles are especially expensive for those driving fossil fuel vehicles. Together, these slides show why, from both an emissions reduction and a cost savings perspective, it is so important to help as many Vermonters as possible move away from driving fossil fuel vehicles. Not only do those vehicles, conservatively speaking, produce, and this is just using the ISO New England grid factor, not Vermont's electricity portfolio. Conservatively speaking, those fossil vehicles produce 6 times as much climate pollution on average as electric vehicles. Fossil vehicles also cost, and this was a recent study from the Union of Concerned Scientists, on average $1,500 a year more to operate and maintain than electric vehicles. EVs are one of the biggest win-win strategies that we have. I should make that win-win-win, 3 wins for those counting, because purchasing electricity keeps dollars recirculating in state, helping support local jobs, rather than most of our energy dollars leaving Vermont when we purchase 100% imported fossil fuels. You can see here the difference in the high cost and price volatility of gasoline and diesel versus the lower cost of charging, especially on off-peak charging rates available through some of our utilities like Green Mountain Power and Burlington Electric Department. So you can see here that while the upfront MSRP cost may on paper look higher for some electric vehicles. When you factor in all of the incentives from federal to state to utility to programs like Replace Your Ride that will be rolling out this year, you can see how low the upfront cost can actually get compared to what the starting price is, especially for lower and lower middle income Vermonters. And this is the point about keeping dollars local and reinvesting in the Vermont economy with our energy purchases. So let's turn now to the thermal sector. And the story here is very similar. Again, upper income folks consume far more heating fuel, and this is actually thermal fuels and electricity combined here, far more than lower income Vermonters do. And yet again, lower income Vermonters have a higher energy burden, spending a higher share of their household income on the heating and electricity that they do need to use. This slide, I'm not going to go through it in detail, there's a lot here, but it shows that there are key differences between the way that Vermonters heat their homes, both by income and in terms of whether or not they rent or own their home. It's worth pointing out here, in particular, the much higher share of lower income renters who are still dependent on old, expensive resistance electric heating systems, which speaks to the importance of addressing the split incentive of landlords who do not improve heating efficiency because their tenants are paying those high bills. And again, we see that the two of the highest cost, most price volatile heating options are propane here in the gray and fuel oil here in the reddish color, whereas renewable heating options like efficient heat pumps and advanced wood heat have been much lower cost and less subject to price volatility, leading to long-term savings. Altogether, this fossil fuel dependence in our transportation and heating sectors leads to an annual $1.5 billion drain on the Vermont economy. In contrast, all of the efficiency and clean options that we have keep a far higher share of our dollars local, whether that's investing in weatherization, heat pumps, electric vehicles, advanced wood heat, biodiesel, and on. And that is a virtuous cycle that supports local jobs and local economic development. So I am now at this point going to hand it over to May, who is going to walk us through our emissions reduction pathways analysis, and then I'll come back to finish it up. And then we, at the end of that, May and I will both take any questions or that are coming up in Slido. Feel free to enter them as we're going.
Thank you, Jared, and it's great to see everybody here today. I'm gonna do a continuation of what Jared's been talking about and discuss another piece of analysis that EAN has been working on, which is the EAN Emissions Reductions Pathways Model. The EAN Pathways Model analysis was initially developed to present pathway scenarios for Vermont to meet its 2025 and 2030 statutory greenhouse gas reductions as requirements as laid out by the Global Warming Solutions Act. We wanted to explore how and if we would be able to meet these requirements since they are rather aggressive. The good news is that we found that we can meet our emissions reductions requirements using current and proven technologies and best practices. Our analysis also focused on energy emissions, which make up around 76% of total emissions. So most of our analysis was focused on the thermal and transportation sectors. So we're exploring how to move beyond fossil fuel transportation and heating options. So not only does this result in emissions reductions benefits, but there are also benefits and major opportunities to strengthening the Vermont economy, creating good paying jobs, saving money, and improve on current equity concerns. As I mentioned, thermal and transportation were the main focus of the analysis, and here you can see the required emissions reductions by sector for both 2025 and 2030, with the transportation shown in green and thermal shown in orange. These are their associated emissions reductions, and you can see that the 2030 emissions reductions will actually be almost 3 times that of 2025. so that there won't be a linear change or necessary. It'll be exponential, and that'll change over time as we move through the coming decade. One other piece I wanted to note is that although the electric sector is part of the energy sector, we did not include any pathways for the electric sector since Vermont's electric generation and power purchases are already very low carbon. However, all new capacity additions were assumed in our analysis to be low carbon, with the entire sector approaching net zero by 2035, which is in line with the renewable energy standard. Another note I'd like to make about this graphic and about our analysis is that the sectoral reductions are in proportion to the amount of emissions that they're responsible for. So for example, transportation is responsible for around 40% of total emissions. So they need to make up, and they do make up, at least 40% of reductions in our analysis. Likewise, the thermal sector is responsible for around 34% of total emissions. So it needs to make up at least 34% of reductions. So that's the big picture of what we're working with the emissions reductions. And looking into the actual results of our analysis, here we see a cross-sectoral view of the highest impact measures for 2025, shown on the left, as well as 2030, shown on the right. In total, we studied around 20 different measures or technology types. And here you can see the top 5 highest impact measures for each sector, 5 in transportation and 5 in thermal. Across both sectors, the key story is that of electrification. On the transportation side, it's driven by electric vehicles, as Jared has mentioned, and on the thermal side by heat pumps. But it's not just about electrification exclusively. It's also about efficiency, renewable fuels, and other options, which are all shown here. And while each measure has a varying degree of impact, in order to meet the emissions reductions that we're looking at, all of them will be needed at the scale and pace as shown in the model. If Vermont falls short on any of the pathways or measures, we will need to supplement with other pathways and measures to make up the difference. It is also important, once again, just to note that while these graphics are presented at the same size, in reality, the reductions for 2030 are 3 times those of 2025. So while it may appear that a specific measure is decreasing over time, such as transportation efficiency improvements, which is shown on the far left in green, the nominal amount of emissions it represents actually grows over that time period. And finally, these pathways are meant to serve an illustrative purpose and are not meant to be narrowly prescriptive. It's meant to show the general scale and pace needed of the most proven and available strategies we know of, rather than what will exactly happen. Taking a step back from specific technology types, I want to focus on each sector, starting with the transportation sector. Both sectors are subdivided into 3 overall pathways, which you see the 3 transportation pathways here, which are made up of many different measures and technology types. So the previous slide was showing those measures, and now we're taking a step back from that. In total, there were 20 different measures that we studied that were split over these 6 pathways across transportation and thermal. These measures were chosen based on current best practices and options, and the model only examines currently identified feasible methodologies and technologies. So digging into the transportation pathways, in the dark green bar, or the darkest green bar here, you see the electrification pathway, which includes EVs, as Jared has discussed, heavy duty electrification, and bus electrification. The middle green bar shows efficiency and low carbon fuels, which includes light vehicle and heavy duty biofuels, hybrid vehicles, efficiency increases in the internal combustion engine vehicles that we have, as well as rail and aviation biofuels. Finally, in the lightest green bar, we have the transportation mode change pathway, which includes carpool and ride sharing for commute purposes, public transportation for commute purposes, bike and walk commuters, telecommuting, rail transit, and reducing the amount of miles that people drive. While these are not the only technology and measure options possible, they are the ones that we identified as having the greatest opportunity for greenhouse gas reductions, along with technical feasibility right now, and thus received the greatest focus for our analysis. No longer examining pathways, but now looking at the individual measures, similar to what was shown in that block graphic that we saw previously. This graphic shows the change in unit count and its accompanying emissions reductions over time. These unit counts should not necessarily be taken as prescriptive. They're more to represent the scale of change needed to meet the emissions targets. Again, the big story is of electrification. You can clearly see the huge ramp rate needed for electric vehicles, which is shown in that far left. And just to clarify, this is only looking at the light vehicle fleet. While it will be a heavy lift to meet these targets, we do believe it's feasible based on information from suppliers. These projections fall in line with what other folks in the space have been modeling, and so they're not just numbers that EIN came up with to meet our objectives, but what other people in the space are looking at. Expanding on the topic of EVs, on the top here, we can see the historic light vehicle fleet composition, as well as the model's projections through 2030. While EVs are still outweighed by ICEs in 2030, you can definitely see the huge growth in the last 10 years of that graphic of electric vehicles. And down below, you can see the historic electric vehicle registrations in Vermont. Last year, a little over 2.5% of new vehicle registrations in the state were EVs. So far this year, nearly 5% of new vehicle sales have been electric. And while that growth is great, in order to meet these emissions reductions targets that we have shown, we're going to need to see that market share ramp up significantly. And we'll need to see around 1 in 4 new vehicles between now and 2025 being electric, and 1 in 2 between 2026 and 2030. Additionally, while there's growth in EVs, that's not the only trend we're seeing. Unfortunately, we're seeing that we're not seeing the full benefit of the increased fuel economy standards because Vermonters are buying bigger and bigger vehicles. So in 2012, 55% of new vehicles purchased in the state were SUVs or pickup trucks. And in 2020, that number increased to 85%. So this is causing a downward pressure on the average fleet mile per gallon that we could see. Now moving on to the thermal sector, again, we have 3 pathways in the thermal sector, which represents a number of different technology types and measures. The highest bar there in the light orange is electrification, which includes cold climate heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, and heat pump water heaters. And that middle green, we have wood and biofuels, which includes advanced wood heat in the residential and commercial applications, RNG, and biofuels. In that medium, the far left bar, we have weatherization and efficiency, which includes weatherization, commercial efficiency, and industrial process efficiencies. Again, electrification will have the greatest impact in the long run. This mostly comes from the installation of efficient heat pump systems into buildings to replace existing fossil fuel-based heating and cooling systems. I would like to note that while weatherization plays the smallest impact in the thermal sector pathways, it plays an important role in the big picture as the effectiveness of many of the other pathways, such as electrification, or particularly electrification, really hinges on having comprehensive weatherization done first or concurrently. Now again, turning to the individual measure view, we can again see the unit counts and the associated emissions reductions. Looking at the highest impact measure, a similar story to that of the transportation sector appears. The greatest lift will be needed in the electrification related measures, which are the heat pumps shown on the far left and heat pump water heaters that are shown on the right. Although their targets are ambitious, we feel comfortable that they're feasible if sufficient focus is given to them. Similar to electric vehicles, we tried to follow industry forecasts or projections when coming up with these numbers. RNG has a similarly significant ramp rate, and the milestone targets we used align with published commitments from DGS's Comprehensive Energy Plan. However, due to uncertainty over the appropriate emissions factor to use, as well as discussion about life cycle emissions, it's difficult to know what its impact will actually be. But based on EIN's current methodology, it does have a very significant emissions reductions impact. Looking at the thermal heat load composition and what we think it'll be through 2030 or what the model shows it'll be, we both expect the heat load, total heat load to decrease from efficiency improvements, as well as becoming more renewable over time. So these both factor into account to seeing the total thermal GHG emissions decreasing so significantly, as you can see in that reddish purplish line in the bottom graph. And finally, I just want to note that, as mentioned previously, we'll need to see large changes in the pace of growth over the next 10 years in order to meet the Global Warming Solutions Act's requirements. And here we're specifically looking at heat pump installations in Vermont, and this is the historic installations through 2020. We can see that these exponential growth trends are starting to occur. So every year we see more and more new heat pumps being installed, and that's shown in the green bar. But however, much effort will still be needed in order to meet the 2025 goal of around 70,000 heat pumps, as shown in the model results. If Vermont continues to see near exponential rates of heat pump adoptions, these trends will be feasible. And we're hoping to see similar trends in the other measures that we discussed, as well as other technology types we might not have discussed or looked at in our model. And with that, I will turn it back over to Jared to continue our discussion. So thank you so much.
Thanks, May. And before I continue on, I just want to pause to give a huge thank you to May for May joined us in just about a year ago and hit the ground running, really is developing this pathways analysis with a lot of support and review. I see many people around the room who helped look at the assumptions, provided feedback on the model. Our senior fellow, Lee Seddon, was involved throughout building on his original Path to Paris analysis, but this was an amazing piece of work. And so just thank you, May. But to continue on, you might, all of this modeled electrification leads to the question about the grid's ability to handle it. The good news is, according to Velco, our current transmission system is capable of handling high levels of electrification like this through 2030, the year that this model is focused on for the next decade. Though relatively smaller scale upgrades at certain points in the distribution system will be necessary and increased load flexibility may be needed. This is possible thanks in large part to the great work done on electric efficiency by Vermonters with the support of efficiency utilities like Efficiency Vermont and Burlington Electric Department, and because of new in-state renewable electricity generation, particularly solar. Specifically, because of all of this work combined, we now have significant amounts of headroom in terms of our peak load capacity. Where our peak loads were over 1,100 megawatts 15 years ago, last year it was under 900 megawatts. And when we efficiently use that excess headroom, it can save all ratepayers money. These pathways would also lead to significant economic benefits for Vermont, including, in many cases, consumer savings and local job creation. In particular, if we succeed in meeting these pathways targets, we will see a massive increase in clean energy employment. And actually, I want to call out Raquel Smith, who is here. One of our amazing summer interns did some modeling about just what that scale of clean energy employment might look like over the decade if we meet these targets. And it's powerful because on average, clean energy jobs are much better paying than the median job in Vermont. But we know that achieving this scale and pace of change and realizing all of these benefits won't happen on its own. We've learned in the electricity sector, the renewable energy standard sets clear requirements with penalties for failures to comply. The result, our electric utilities have met or exceeded the required performance standard every year, driving down emissions and benefiting Vermonters. To guarantee progress like this in other sectors, regulatory clarity and policy frameworks that provide both carrots and sticks are now necessary, especially in those transportation and thermal sectors. Because without new regulatory and policy frameworks, we end up in very odd situations like this, where we have the cleanest energy sector, the electricity sector, paying the highest amount in taxes and fees, while the dirtiest energy sectors and fuels pay the lowest amount, contributing the least to efficiency and progress. So in summary, we have legally binding requirements. That's a responsibility, yes, but it's also a massive opportunity, especially because we know benefits and costs are not being equitably shared. And this is an opportunity to get beyond an inequitable fossil fuel system and move to a more equitable, efficient, clean system that benefits especially our lower income neighbors. We know that these commitments are achievable, as May showed, and our modeling and the modeling of others showed, including recently the LEAP modeling that TJ and others from the Public Service Department shared with the Vermont Climate Council. And we know that Vermont consumers and workers can benefit from this transition and these pathways and measures we're talking about. But again, to do so, it's not just about business as usual. We can't just rely on markets alone. We need to send clear signals through regulatory frameworks and through new policy initiatives to ensure that that happens, similar to what we've done for the electricity sector. With that, I want to say that we are now happy to hear any questions that you might have. I think Cara is looking at, you can pose a question there or vote up others' questions there.
Okay, so the first question we had that I wanted to answer myself was, are these slides in your annual report? And the answer to that is yes. And they also are in May, some of them are also in May's white paper that we produced and is also available on our website. Has anyone in this room tried upvoting a question, and is that working? I'm not seeing questions being up. I will ask another question. Many heat pumps installed seem to be for cooling. How can we make sure they're used for heating as well as cooling? Do you have any answer to that one?
That's a great question. When we talk to installers, I know we had a conversation recently with Mark Stevenson from Vermont Energy Contracting. We hear that time and again that for many Vermonters, the primary kind of impetus for installing heat pumps is for cooling, and they don't necessarily get used for heating, certainly not to the full extent that they could. So I think that's a really important point. It's not just about installing them, it's also about making sure that they get used efficiently and well throughout the year as much as possible, not just for cooling. I know that utilities are and others are tracking that. I think VGS has some interesting data, others, and it's something that is a really important issue. That's a great question.
Thanks. Okay, the next question we have is, are leases as well as purchase of EVs included in your summary of growth in use of EVs?
In the current analysis that we've done, we don't include a cost component, so that's something that we'd like to do in the future. We just say that it's a new vehicle that's on the road or that's replacing another vehicle in the fleet. So we don't include either leasing or buying as a component into the analysis that we've done. But that's something that we'd like to do in the future, is to study that and the economic or do a cost benefit analysis or something like that, cost effectiveness. But we currently don't have that as something we've studied.
But in terms of the overall targets, it's a focus on EV registrations. So electric vehicles, whether you're buying or leasing them, replacing a fossil vehicle, and that's where the emissions reduction and cost savings are coming from.
So the next question is actually more of a comment. There's a comment here that's getting some upvotes, making the point that nuclear is far from zero carbon. So just a comment that somebody wanted to share. And then there's another.
I'll just note briefly that the emissions estimates that were used for the Pathways model were based on the current in-boundary greenhouse gas inventory that the Agency of Natural Resources does. But there's a process underway to begin building on that, making more comprehensive the analysis of our emissions, including accounting for the life cycle or upstream emissions of our energy use. So we will be able to have eventually a clearer handle on the upstream emissions from some electricity sources that are currently counted as zero carbon, but are probably more accurately understood as lower carbon than the fossil options. Thank you.
There seems to be a lot of interest in the question, what method do you imagine will reduce agricultural emissions? Is that a question you would like to take?
Sure, if it's there and it's getting upvotes, you know, I mean, and I would invite May to speak to this too. We are primarily focused in our modeling on the energy sectors. I do think, you know, most of our agriculture sector emissions come from enteric fermentation, the digestive processes of cows and other ruminant animals, and from manure. I do think that there are some exciting studies about like feed management and dietary supplements in terms of different types of seaweed and other things that can reduce methane emissions from livestock. At the same time, I also think the agriculture sector is different. I personally think that you know, it's most important to focus on the sectors where we have win-win, cost-effective emissions reduction options, which we clearly have in the energy sectors. And you know, if there are not those options emerging as much in the agriculture sector, I, for one, would be supportive of basically asking other sectors to do more and the agriculture sector to do maybe a little bit less until there are those cost-effective, beneficial options for reduction there.
Thank you. Do the pathways models account for potential population change, for example, from climate migration?
That's something we're thinking about, but the initial version of the model that we created does not include population growth. But that's something that's been on our to-do list for including in a future iteration, as we do recognize that it's not realistic to just assume a flat population over the next 10 to 30 years.
I think I'm just going to take one more question to try to move us forward on our agenda. Are plug-in hybrids included in the modeling?
Sorry.
Yes, we include both all electric vehicles as well as plug-in hybrids. We also include assumptions related to the share of how much each of those make up in terms of the new electric vehicles. So right now, the majority of EVs, and if we go back to that screen, with the electrification, the EV registrations. So the blue bars here are plug-in hybrids and the green are all electric. So you can see that plug-in hybrids right now outweigh all electric. However, given current trends, that proportion is actually changing. So all electric are starting to increase in that proportion. And we have that assumption built in that over time, all electric will eventually outweigh plug-in hybrids. But that's just to say, yes, we include both in our analysis.
So the good news, or part of the good news, is that even with our little just tech delay, we're only 10 minutes behind. We might make that up over lunch or in other parts of the agenda this morning, but I would just, for other kind of speakers and panelists who are coming up soon, just want to say, and to everybody, just think of shifting the agenda back, add 10 minutes to everything until lunch, and lunch may be 50 minutes rather than a full hour. But thank you, May. I think now at this point, we're ready to move on to our next